Hi, hello. We're just going to wait for a minute or two while everybody logs on. So I'm Emily Casra, and I will wait. And hopefully, you can hear and you can see, and look forward to this wonderful event. And I think we can get going. So good morning if you're in LA or the West Coast or Vancouver, and good day if you're in New York or Chicago or Toronto, and a good evening for people across the UK and Israel, and a good very middle of the night if you're tuning in live from Melbourne. My name is Emily Casriel, and I'm a trustee of the Wingate Foundation, and delighted to welcome you to the inaugural event of the Global Jewish Literary Alliance. It's really wonderful to see organizations from across the world coming together to support and encourage those who in this work, Jewish writers and those writing about Jewish life, Jewish history, culture, and ideas. As you might know, the Jewish Literary Prize was created in the UK in 1977 and is now run together with JW3, the Jewish Community Centre for London. And what it does, it finds the best book, might be fiction, might be non-fiction, to translate the idea of Jewishness for the general reader. So we're really thrilled to be working together with the founding partners of the GLA. That's our friends at JW3, the JCC Association of North America, and the US-based Jewish Book Council. So today we've got a unique opportunity to hear a conversation between the winner of this year's Wingate Prize, Simon Parkin, who's here in Sussex, and the Jewish Book Council's National Jewish Book Awardee, Susan Wilder, who I believe is in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Thank you so much to everybody who works so hard to make this event happen. We're truly grateful. So now it's my pleasure to hand over to Miri Pomerantz-Dauber, the Associate Director of the Jewish Book Council, to tell you more about this event. Over to you, Miri.
Thank you so much, Emily. We at Jewish Book Council in the US are excited as well, and we can't wait to hear from these two amazing authors for this inaugural event. If you didn't know, Jewish Book Council is a not-for-profit that aims to enrich, educate, and strengthen community through Jewish literature. Each year, JBC reaches more than 500,000 readers with weekly book reviews, author interviews, and essays, arranges around 1,400 Jewish literary programs around North America, publishes the literary journal Paper Brigade, presents the National Jewish Book Awards, sponsors Jewish Book Month, and provides discussion questions resources to over 2,500 book clubs, among other activities. We are so honored to be involved as a founding member of the Global Jewish Literary Alliance, along with JW3, the Wingate Foundation, and the Jewish Community Center Association of North America. The Global Jewish Literary Alliance is an international alliance that aims to encourage more writers to write Jewish content and to explore what that might be, as well as to provide annually updated resources, available now on our website, to connect professionals and writers and create community. All of the collaborating organizations strive to connect with our Jewish communities in a deeper way, and this alliance will help us do that. Today's event is being moderated by Doron Krakow, the President and CEO of JCC Association of North America. With 170 Jewish community centers across North America and 1.5 million people engaged each week, the JCC Association of North America is the largest network in the North American Jewish landscape, hence their place and role as a founding member of the Global Jewish Literary Alliance. Since joining JCC Association, Doron has guided the organization in strengthening ties across the JCC movement, forging new partnerships and deepening its relationships with philanthropic donors in a determined pursuit of greater Jewish community across the US and Canada. Krakow brings more than 30 years of experience with Jewish organizations to his work. He's a member of the Executive Council of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, Vice Chair of the JPRO Network Board, and the board member of SOFIM, Friends of Israel Scouts. He holds an MBA from Cornell University and a bachelor's degree in economics from Rutgers University. Doron is a huge reader and a lover of literature, particularly Jewish literature. He regularly walks over to us in the office to raid the shelves at JBC, and we're happy to see him there. And here, welcome, Doron.
Thank you, Miri, and thank you, Emily. And now I see my secret's out. I've been caught raiding the shelves at Jewish Book Council, but it is a delight to have Jewish Book Council as our neighbor. And I'm very proud to be included in this inaugural event of this extraordinary Global Jewish Literary Alliance. So let me add my word of welcome to those of you who are joining us from anywhere and everywhere across the Jewish and literary world. You are in for a treat as we have two remarkable authors, award-winning authors with whom we're going to spend the next hour in conversation. Just a quick word about our format. So I'm going to introduce our two authors. I'll have an opportunity to speak with them directly and to be in conversation with them. And later in our hour, we're going to open up for questions from the audience. You should feel free at any time along the way to put your questions into the chat. They will be compiled, and roughly at a quarter to the hour, we'll begin to take your questions as part of this process. I do want to underscore the fact that I am a bit of a bookworm and have spent an awful lot of time reading a lot about Holocaust history and Holocaust literature. And so it was particularly poignant for me to be taken so beautifully by surprise by the stories that were unearthed by our two remarkable authors, and to get new insights into a subject with which many of us feel quite familiar. If you've read these books, you know already what I'm talking about. If you haven't read them yet, I expect you're going to be heading for the store or for the shelves shortly after today's program. So with that, let me turn to our two authors. Simon Parkin is an award-winning British journalist and author, a contributing writer for The New Yorker. He has also written for The Guardian, The Observer, The New York Times, Harper's Magazine, New Statesman, the BBC, and a host of other publications. He is the author of two prior books of nonfiction, A Game of Birds and Wolves and Death by Video Game, and his work has been featured in the Best American Non-Required Reading. He was named a finalist in the Foreign Press Association Media Awards and is the recipient of 2 awards from the Society of Professional Journalists. Simon's book, The Island of Extraordinary Captives, is the topic of our time together today. Simon, welcome.
Hi there. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you. So pleased to be here. Thank you.
Wonderful. And let me add our second author, Susan Wider. Susan is a graduate of the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey and of the University of New Mexico. She has written for Orion, The Magazine, The Fourth River, and Wild Hope Magazine, among others. Prior to becoming a full-time writer, she held senior management positions at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, the Santa Fe Institute, and the Lovelace Respiratory Research Institute. Earlier in her career, she taught American English for the French Chamber of Commerce in Normandy, France, and worked as a violinist in several professional chamber and symphony orchestras. It's My Whole Life is her inaugural work as a published author, book author, and we are delighted to add her to our panel. Susan, welcome aboard.
Thank you. Happy to see everyone and delighted to be here.
Terrific. So let me begin by asking each of you, I'll put you on the spot and say, give us the elevator speech version overview of our book. I'm not sure all of our participants today have had the good fortune to read it, but if you had to give the very brief overview synopsis, Susan, let me start with you.
It's My Whole Life is a biography for teen readers about the life of a German Jewish artist in hiding in the south of France during the Holocaust.
Wonderful. Thank you, Susan. Simon.
My book seeks to tell the story of the internment policy in the UK when, in the summer of 1940, the British government interned almost 30,000 predominantly Jewish refugees in camps on the Isle of Man and elsewhere in the country. And I tell that story through the character of Peter Fleischmann, a 17-year-old artist who comes to Britain on the Kinder transport, only to be put in a camp by the people who have saved him.
You are also already both off on a wonderful beginning to be able to capture and encapsulate your remarkable works in so few words. But what was noteworthy to me getting right out of the gate is the matter of choice of subject. It's through art that you are exposing us to strands of one of the most storied parts of modern history. And I'm curious what it was that drew you to your topics initially. Again, Susan, can we begin with you?
Happily, because it's a lovely story to tell. I discovered Charlotte Solomon's art and immediately fell in love with it back in 2015. And it was because of an artist, a New York artist named Myra Kalman, whose work I love. And in two separate interviews, I saw Myra speaking about this artist, Charlotte Solomon, and the profound influence her work had had on Myra. And so immediately I had to go find out who this Charlotte Solomon was. And I immediately discovered two things. No one had written a biography of Charlotte until, since the mid 1990s. And no one had ever written about her at all for a younger audience. And those things combined with my love of her paintings and the emotion she was putting into her art. And I thought, I'm going to research this and see if I can deliver just such a book for this particular audience.
And Susan, as a first-time author in this kind of a format, were you drawn to the young adult audience as a specific target, or was it something about the topic that resonated for you with the audience intended?
I think it was in part seeing that no one had done this for that audience. And in part, I was a fussy reader when I was a younger person. I disliked being told what to read. I liked finding things out for myself. So I thought I could perhaps bring something to this audience that might combine not only the art, but the story, the time period. And interestingly, the book is being read by many adults. It started out as a book for younger readers, and it's I hear from artists who tell me they're gifting it to artist friends, which I think is lovely. So it obviously is having a different reach than I had even expected.
It certainly is. Thank you, Susan. Simon, you also chose the world of art and artists as the window into a remarkable story. Tell us a little bit about what drew you to the subject.
Well, I was in the National Archives in South London. I was actually doing some research into a slightly different subject about prisoner of war camps in England at the time. There had been this stately home in the Lake District that was used to house captured U-boat officers. And it sort of struck me like that sounded a bit like Downton Abbey, but with Nazis, that I thought could be an interesting story. And while I was going through some of the documents, I came across a handmade magazine that had been made in a camp, and it looked like it had been written by German prisoners, but it was very fervently anti-Nazi, and it was filled with amazing illustrations and pieces of writing from well-known journalists. And so that set me on this path to find out more about the world of internment and why this rather extraordinary group of individuals ended up in one camp in particular on the Isle of Man, Hutchinson Camp, which is where my protagonist, Peter, a young artist, also ends up.
And so there is a little bit of a synergy here between Susan's approach to a young adult audience and your having chosen a protagonist amongst any number of luminary artists who was also a young adult at the time. Say a few words about why Peter Fleischmann was the right lead player in this particular story.
Yeah, well, Peter is sort of a Forrest Gump character almost for me, in that he just seems to be in all these key locations at key moments of the story of the Second World War and the events leading up to it. So he was living in an orphanage in Berlin during the November pogroms. He manages to escape the city and hide in a cellar of his family's housekeeper. Then he's on the very first kinder transport to leave Germany and arrive in England. So we have photographs of him. In fact, I have one of the pictures, if someone could bring it up, my first image, which shows him arriving in Harwich in Essex on the very first kinder transport, and he's sort of walking across the railway. You can see him there holding his art folder under his arm. And then because he's not yet 17 when this picture is taken, so he's at this point a refugee. And then during the next 2 years, he becomes an adult. And so when the British government's internment policy comes in, he's sent to one of the camps. And then after he's eventually released, he goes back to Berlin, where he visits the site of the orphanage where he grew up. He becomes a translator during the Nuremberg trials. he was a very useful person to as a vehicle to tell this story, because he's almost in the right place at the wrong time, lots and lots of times.
So it's quite remarkable. He begins almost as an anonymous, as you said, a Forrest Gump-like bystander to the story, whose life goes on to have great meaning after the chapter of the Holocaust and the Second World War is over. Meanwhile, Charlotte, the protagonist, Susan, of your book, is a more accomplished artist when our story begins, but her life story is much more tragically cut short. Say a little bit about what it was about this particular story and this particular artist that drew your attention.
Well, I think it was interesting to watch her trajectory. So she was born in Berlin in 1917 and grew up there, and then had a couple of she had a difficult life in many ways. Never mind the things that happened later that had to do with the Holocaust. She struggled to get into art school. She struggled to even convince her stepmother, not so much her father, to let her take art classes in the first place. So she was dealing with family issues even before things started to get awkward. We could perhaps bring up my second image, because that is a look at, yes, that is a look at a huge transformation between the time she failed her first attempt to get into the Berlin Art Academy. And then this is a painting she did of herself later, working, practicing, learning everything she could to eventually pass the exam the second time. So things were going reasonably well art-wise, but then after Kristallnacht, thank you, I think we can pull the image down now. After Kristallnacht, her parents, at that time, father and stepmother, sent her to the south of France, where her grandparents were already refugees. And at that point, it's sort of an interesting different type of captivity to the kind of captivity Simon describes. But Charlotte is stuck. She's stuck with her grandparents, and it's not interesting. It's not fun. She's sort of captive in a different way, although she absolutely blossoms artistically when she reaches the south of France. So I felt that her whole trajectory was just fascinating, because looking at, I don't have an image today here, but her art school paintings are gray. The descriptions of how she dressed to go to class, gray. And then she gets to the Nice region and explodes with color. So it was just very fun to watch her whole artistic, really blossoming.
It's a transformation in a very short period of time. So I said earlier on that I read a lot on the topic of the Second World War, on the topic of the Holocaust. Most of the settings of the things that I read are either Germany or Poland. They are certainly Central or Eastern Europe. Each of you wrote a book that is almost entirely set in the western part of Europe, Susan in France and Simon in the UK. And Simon, I think that the whole story about the internment of German expatriates during the early part of the Second World War was what was so striking to me. And I noted, I believe it's on the third page of your book, and those who will read it will find Simon did such a beautiful job of creating the stage, setting the backdrop to what was happening as World War II was beginning to unfold. But you indicate that Winston Churchill, who was one of the great heroic figures of that period, on his third day as prime minister, authorized the internment of all German expatriate men between the age of 16 and 60 with no distinction. This is a blot on the record of Churchill. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that as an important contextual element to this story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's perhaps difficult to understand why he would have made that decision so early into his premiership, but I think it's important to remember that the feeling at the time that was that Britain was about to be invaded. The Nazis were in France and poised to sail across the English Channel. And so the government had started distributing leaflets saying what to do when the enemy arrives. It wasn't a question of whether it was going to happen, it was when. And there had been stories coming across from Europe that when the German army had invaded certain countries, such as the Netherlands, that people posing as Jewish and Austrian refugees in those countries had actually emerged and revealed themselves to be agents and spies to then assist fifth columnists. They were called to assist with the invasion. And so these stories were being told in the tabloid press in the UK, and there was a huge amount of fear and anxiety that a similar situation was about to happen in the UK. So this was really the context in which Churchill makes that decision. It's better to just round up anyone with a German or an Austrian passport, and then later Italians as well, to put them in internment camps. And then, as the phrase that was used time and again at the time was, sort the sheep from the goats at that point. But of course, this meant that the vast majority of people who were interned were refugees from Nazi oppression. They had already endured the trauma of fleeing their lives, their livelihoods in Europe, leaving their businesses. Some of them had already been incarcerated in German camps as well, at Dachau and Buchenwald, to escape and then come to the UK. So you can imagine the renewed trauma that people went through when this internment policy was brought in.
And among the very disturbing byproducts of that, you literally had thousands of German Jews and Austrian Jews who were fleeing for their very lives, who found themselves interned with people who were sympathetic to the Nazi cause and for one reason or another had found themselves in the UK. Did that add a layer of complexity and trauma that came through in the research that you undertook? Or how would you characterize that aspect of the reality of this juxtaposition of populations caught in the same net, but coming from very different circumstances?
Well, I would say it was definitely a minority of Nazi sympathizers who were in the internment camps. But of course, that doesn't mean that it wasn't a huge anxiety for everyone who was there. And, there were, as you can imagine, there were rumors flying around that such and such had been, spotted in Germany as being, in the Hitler Youth or something like that. And lots of stories went around, lots of accusations flying. Some of the camps were more intense than others. So a few months prior to internment, everyone who had come to Britain in the months leading up to the war, who was known as a so-called enemy alien, had to stand in front of a judge and tell their story, give an account of themselves, and then they were categorized according to their risk. Category A if they were definitely Nazi supporters, Category C if they were definitely legitimate refugees, and B if there were questions. So some of the camps were just for Category A's, some of the camps were for Category C's, but of course the tribunals weren't always the most rigorous process. So it did end up where there were some Nazi sympathizers in amongst genuine refugees, which, as you can imagine, caused tremendous problems, particularly, I should say, in the women's camp, where those distinctions were much more pronounced and caused great difficulties.
And in the midst of war, clearly the attempt to be diligent and detail-oriented gave way to the needs to be expedient and to deal with issues more broadly. And as a result, again, people got swept up in things highly inappropriate for any number of them. Susan, the story about Charlotte takes place differently, almost outside of the realm of Nazi control. And we're following her path, social path, a romantic path, a familial path in which she's undergoing this artistic emergence. Talk a little bit about Charlotte's engagement with the war and the degree to which the war was defining the nature of the way she was living her life on a day-to-day basis.
Well, certainly if we go back to Berlin, when she was growing up, it was encroaching, and it was creeping up on her in strange ways. As an example, in her what would be the equivalent of like a middle school here, she has classmates who do not know they are Jewish until the school requires documents and papers be brought into the school. Now, Charlotte grew up in an assimilated Jewish family, so they celebrated Christmas. She may or may not have worshipped with her family. Some of those things are a bit vague in our knowledge of her, but it was a constant surprise. And we see her later when she's in France and paints her masterwork, which is really her life story. She gives us scenes of park benches that she's not supposed to sit on. And so she sneaks a little, rendezvous with her lover. It's coming at her from lots of directions, but I still think Kristallnacht and her father being immediately arrested as a result were surprises. There was still, as we know, it can't really be happening. It can't be that bad. This cannot be the case. Surely not. These are human beings. How could they be doing these things? So, and her father wastes no time after Kristallnacht. Beginning of December, they have her on a train to the south of France, thinking, of course, that this is going to be the safe haven. And, we know that it isn't. But even when she gets there, her relationship with her grandparents is deteriorating. She's having trouble meeting people, making friends. It's just continuously complex, but there's art. And her ability to not only remember some of the theories of this man she was so much in love with back in Berlin about how to survive and trying to embody the things that he tried to show her, she's also putting that on the page in her paintings. But additionally, I have to say this as a writer, she also writes a 33,000 word manuscript to go with these paintings. So for me, I was as much fascinated by the writing, which is also beautiful, as the way the art moved forward, in spite of the encroachment and the danger.
I'd like to stay on the subject of the art a little bit, because she really, till very late in the story, she manages to stay just beyond the periphery of the grasp of the Nazis and their collaborators in France. But in those few years, she produces a volume of artworks that might otherwise take a lifetime to produce. What was it about Charlotte, the person, the artist, the circumstances that enabled her to produce at such a colossally grand level, both in terms of the numbers of works, but also in the diversity of works and in the richness of the work she produced?
We know from people who knew her that she had a remarkable memory and was able to paint, which is why in the south of France, she's painting things. She's even painting things she didn't witness in Berlin, like, when she's baby, when she's growing up. These are things she may have seen in photographs. But she continues to bring all of that into her art. And even back in Berlin, as she tells us later, she was focused. She was, I'll say obsessed, but she talks about herself when she learns to etch, and she says, I'm going to keep doing this until I get it right. I'm going to keep doing this over and over until it's right. So she always had this sense within herself of what she wanted to put on the page. And of course, she's only working from the three primary colors and a little bit of white. So she's creating all these beautiful colors from very limited materials. And while she's doing it, so to respond to what you just said, she paints over the course of debatably a year and a half to 2 years. I think we're looking at more like a year and a half. Close to 1,300 paintings. They're roughly, notebook sized. So she's doing this at a 3 a day. And then she picks close to 800 of those and decides that those are going to be this, what I'm calling her masterwork. She calls it life, question mark, or theater, question mark. Lots of interpretations for what she might have meant. But within that context, there are close to 800 paintings. The 33,000 words that I just mentioned, that's the English translation. She creates a soundtrack to go with that. So the entire time she's painting, she has music going through her head that she wants you as the reader, viewer, to be either thinking. At one point she says she wants you to hum some of her words to that music. And then she does this other wonderful thing, at least at the beginning, she creates theatrical settings for all of this. And she does it by using transparent overlay pages. And she attaches those. And in fact, maybe could we quickly go to my first image and I can show how this worked? Yes, this one. So two things that are happening here. This is one of the images early in Life for Theater where she created an overlay. And this is also an example of how Charlotte is often viewed as an early graphic novelist. Because at the beginning, certainly not at the end, but at the beginning, she has more time, or thinks she does, and she's painting all these detailed scenes of what's happening. And then the overlay for this would fold down, she taped it to the left, it would fold over, and the words were painted or handwritten on top to correspond to each of these images. So that's where we get this sense of sort of graphic novel precursor in what she was doing.
So interesting. And I think, Susan, one of the things that was so remarkable to me with this huge volume of paintings that she produced, it was effectively a visual memoir. She wrote, she described and labeled, but your choice of title, It's My Whole Life, is actually a reflection of the collection. Her works were the story of her life, an abbreviated life, a remarkable life. Simon, I want to pivot to you and talk a little bit about Peter Fleischmann. Peter was a boy with notable talent, potential as an artist. It was actually during his internment on the Isle of Man that he emerges as an artistic talent because of the setting and the people with whom he was interned. Can you talk a little bit about the interplay between the venerable artists who were there and this young aspiring artist who found himself alone in their midst?
Yeah, so Hutchinson Camp on the Isle of Man, just really through happenstance, had this dense concentration of amazing artists venerated from Europe who had arrived in this camp really through sheer chance that they were grouped together. And it's quite soon after Peter arrives that the artists take him under their wing. Peter, when he was living in Berlin, attended the Royal School of Art in Berlin briefly until he had to leave. So he did have some talent and experience, obviously, to get into that institution, and he'd worked as a professional artist when he got to the UK as well. And so when he realizes that there are all these fantastic artists in the camp, he sort of signs up to the classes that are going on, and he takes life drawing lessons from Kurt Schwitters, who is perhaps the most famous of the artists among the group. If we bring up my third image, actually, it's one of the many portraits done by Kurt Schwitters in Hutchinson Camp. This is a portrait of a chap called Bruno Ahrens, who was an architect from Berlin, and he is the man who 4 days after the opening of Hutchinson Camp decides to organize a schedule of lectures, including art classes as well. So we've got Bruno to thank. Peter's got Bruno to thank for the lessons that he attended, and so he's taking life drawing lessons. He's also there are sculptors in the camp that he's learning to smuggle clay from the hills in the Isle of Man when they're allowed out of the camp for walks. He brings it back into the camp and learns how to use that clay to cast with. And he's borrowing books from the camp library, using these scandalously rather as canvases for him to do his artwork in. He's cutting the collars off shirts, becoming proficient in all manner of different techniques really from, that he's learning from the people here. The artists in the camp had decided to set up an artists' cafe, as they called it, in one of the outbuildings to one of their houses on the square, and Peter is admitted into that, and so they have poetry recitals and readings, and they eat cake together and all things like that. So it's sort of a very rudimentary approximation, perhaps, of the Austrian cafes that some of these men were used to, just in the camp setting. But it's among this fantastic group of people that Peter really starts to see his talents mature. And it's in November of the 1940, so a couple of months after he first arrives, that they have a large art exhibition in the camp. Peter submits 3 pictures for that, which are accepted, and so he gets to exhibit alongside some of these much better known artists at the time.
Simon, I want to draw you out a little bit further. It almost seems incongruous to say we're talking about an internment camp for people who are suspected of potentially being a fifth column in the midst of a world war, and yet there's an artist cafe, there are exhibitions. In the end, we know that there's a newspaper or a journal that was archived, that from which you source so much of the research that you began to do. It was not, they certainly were not luxuriating. Can you talk a little bit about how did it come to pass that they created a community, an artistic community of this kind, and that they were tolerated, allowed and enabled to do the things that they did in order to have a window into civilization from behind the barbed wire?
Was the policy of the British Army to allow these camps to be self-governing. This was really a technique that the British had learned while colonizing different countries, I suppose, where if you invest the people that you're colonizing with their self-governance, then they're less likely to rebel. And so really the behind the barbed wire, the internees were left to organize themselves, and so they quickly established a hierarchy. They had a camp father, they had street fathers as well, and then within each house community, which had about 30 men to a house, there was a house father as well, and they had, as you can imagine, endless meetings discussing how they were going to run themselves. And this allowed for the artistically inclined individuals to organize that side of things as well. So there were engineers as well who set up teaching for the younger people in the camp, and the artists did the same thing and sort of allowed themselves to explore that side of what they were doing. There were some key individuals in the camp who helped facilitate that. A young art historian called Klaus Hinrichsen was really instrumental in gathering the artists. There was also a art dealer called Siegfried Oppenheimer, who I suppose saw an opportunity to get to know some artists that perhaps after he's released he might be able to represent them, and he did in fact represent some of them as their art dealer. So there are various forces at play. The British major, the commandant who was in charge of Hutchinson, his wife Marjorie was a frustrated artist herself. Her parents had forbidden her from going to art college, so when she realizes that there are so many artists in the camp, she encourages him to buy them supplies and to set aside a space for them to use for painting and for lessons as well. So it's sort of all of these factors working together that allow this community.
And you alluded to it a little bit. They were literally scraping together supplies. They were making paints and stains. They were cobbling together junk essentially to manufacture into the things they needed to paint and sculpt, or to sculpt with those things themselves. I found it fascinating, Simon, that the Isle of Man was not used as an internment camp for the first time in the Second World War. They were already using it in that regard in the First World War and other islands in the Irish Sea. Sort of another fascinating aspect. So it's incredibly complex. We are talking about art in the depths of perhaps the worst nightmare in modern history, and yet there is art. Always there is art. Can you both reflect a little bit, and Susan, let me start with you, on the significance of art and creation, even amidst the worst darkness?
Charlotte is certainly a beautiful example. She manages to keep herself going through her art, and she gets help. The American heiress Audley Moore, who sheltered her when she first arrived and remained her friend in France, was very quick to purchase paintings from Charlotte, to keep her painting, to encourage her to continue. Her doctor, Georges Moridis, also there in the town, same thing. The minute he saw things beginning to unravel, he encouraged her. And finally, when she knows she's beginning to feel the pressure of what the war is doing to her region, she closes herself off in a hotel and does nothing but paint, saying, I have to finish this, I have to finish this. And she was somehow managing to keep going in spite of it. And of course she wasn't alone. We have many, many other examples of artists who were able to use this as a touch point, as a way to try at least to survive. And many did, many did not. But I think at heart, Charlotte was very much, she says that she felt she had something to say to humanity. And she wanted to try and make a name for herself as an artist. So it was that plus her determination that I think kept the demons, not only the personal internal demons that she was dealing with, but also everything to do with the war around her.
Both conscious and accomplished beyond her years. Her story, as I understood it, included probably multiple opportunities that she had to escape the net that was closing in around her. And she did not elect to avail herself of every possible opportunity. And your book, of course, focuses primarily on her life as an artist and what she managed to create. The postscript of the book tells about the very sad end to which she came, but it's not a featured component of the book. Do you want to comment a little bit about those last months of her life?
The last months, yes, we think she finished creating all these paintings and all of this art in, I think, let's see, August of 42. And then she adds a postscript in February of 43, where she's kind of had it. She's got the art done. She's got she called it a book at times, done, but she still has things she wishes she could escape. And on the one hand, they know Hitler is coming. She also has a failing, very miserable, very unhappy, very weak grandfather. And being with him is very difficult as well. So she makes she uses the word courageous decision to use some of the drugs that many people left Germany with and here we will remain inconclusive because we do not know Charlotte's intention. She does use these drugs in his food. And we also have an instance earlier in Life for Theater where she asks her grandfather to please do the same thing for her grandmother, who is also struggling. So we walk a fine line here between intent and what was really going on with her, but it was a huge decision. And she also stays behind because she marries eventually, and her husband is ill and she wants very much to help. She talks about this as a chance to love someone again after leaving behind her great love in Berlin. So it's dark. It's terribly, terribly dark. But in spite of all of that, I was motivated to tell her story as an artist. And I'm happy to see that you really resonated to that. Because I think there are, I'll mention something that my sister has said to me on a number of occasions. When we look at Holocaust artists, we need to look at the Holocaust story. But these individuals need to be remembered as more than that. they are more than just what happened to them during the Holocaust. And I hope the book helps to show her as an artist as well as someone who struggled greatly with too many things.
Yeah, and some of the very many regular things that people in complicated families have always suffered from, will always suffer from. We're going to pivot to questions from our audience in a minute, but Simon, I wanted to ask you first, if you wouldn't mind commenting again on the art is always there, and art as a window into this particular story. And you mentioned that Hutchinson, in the end, the number of artists who were there were a minority of the people who were interned. It's not that they were mostly artists, and yet art is the center of gravity here. Talk a little bit again about art as a medium for telling this narrative.
Well, art fulfilled all sorts of different roles in the camp. I think, it was for some of the artists, a cause to bring in some levity, and they would draw dancing girls on the walls of the rooms where they were staying. For others, it was a way to express the misery that they were going through. So, for example, Fred Ullman, who was a lawyer turned artist interned in the camp, he misses the birth of his daughter Caroline because he's interned, and so he draws lots of quite gloomy pictures with a motif of a young girl holding a balloon, and then scenes of barbed wire and things like that. Herman Feckenbach, who was had fought in the First World War, is also interned. He's a fantastic lino cut artist, and he uses art as a way to express some of the things he's been through. So he goes on hunger strike in one of the transit camps that's overcrowded, where the British Army sort of take belongings, and he records that in his art. And then when he gets to Hutchinson on the Isle of Man, he does some beautiful pictures of sort of a man looking out to sea through the barbed wire with the sun rising, and then another one where the barbed wire's gone, and sort of a hope of longing for freedom, I suppose. So once again, art fulfills all of these different roles for different people in different places and ways.
Remarkable. I am struck of late, we had Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, not very long ago, that we're living in a world with a diminishing number of eyewitnesses. The historiography, the books, the literature, and the art that emerged from that period is the continuity of memory. And each of these protagonists in your two books themselves made contributions, and through their art and their connection to the artistic world, left a legacy behind that allows these stories to continue to be told. Susan, how do you think at this stage Charlotte's story would match with the expectations that she would have hoped would have been left behind with regard to how she was remembered?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Because she was working so hard to try and do this thing. And of course, she left Berlin before she had an opportunity to have any kind of show, to participate in any kind of exhibition then, even at art school, maybe a few, just in terms of classes. I don't think she herself would want to be remembered solely as a wartime, I had a tough time painter. I think there are some paintings at Yad Vashem, actually, in their art museum, of some of her paintings that were not part of Life or Theater, and they give you a completely different sense. There's not this rushed sense of getting my story told before things really turn bad. They're light, they're beautiful, they're sort of trauma free, and they're quite wonderful. So she would want, I think, to have been remembered as an artist first and foremost, and a good one.
And I think your book does a beautiful job of fulfilling that particular hope. Simon, we have a question from one of our participants who says that in light of the fact that there were some things that seemed quite positive relative to our images of internment going on the Isle of Man, give us the other side. What was the dark side of internment beyond imprisonment itself, but the experiences that Peter and others had there that reflect the worst of internment?
Well, yes, I mean, there were nearly 30,000 people interned, so you can imagine there's no one experience of internment. There's a full range. It would depend a bit, perhaps, on the age of the internee. So people who were late teens, early 20s would generally have a much sunnier time because for them, they were less invested, perhaps, in the outside world, and it was a bit more of an adventure. If you were middle-aged and your wife and your family were in London, which was being blitzed at the time, you didn't know if they were going to be safe there. You didn't know how they were going to be provided for. The camp experience was just one long stretch of anxiety. There were multiple suicides in Hutchinson and in other camps. The ordeal that many people went through brought on health problems. More than 50 people are recorded to have died on the Isle of Man through internment, many to heart problems and things like that. There was a huge amount of anxiety about this invasion I was talking about earlier. The idea that if the Nazis turn up in Britain, then the British have already done the job of putting most of the Jews in camps for them, ready to be collected. And so there were lots of discussions of what would happen if the Isle of Man was invaded, or if the Germans arrived there. Would you stand and fight? Would you take your own life? And each individual had to make their own decision on that. So yes. As Klaus Hinrichsen said a few years later when he was talking about some of these things, he said, lest it all sounds too rosy a situation, all of these activities were undertaken as a means of distraction from the ever-present anxiety of things that were pushing against them.
Fascinating. And there were instances in which the German army did manage to conquer British island, sovereign islands that were part of the British Empire. So the idea of the oncoming Nazis was something that was very real, particularly during the Blitz of London. Susan, the artist, Peter Fleischmann and others that survived their internment on the Isle of Man had lives afterwards in which their art and work continued to be produced and allows us a very clear trail of breadcrumbs back to the story. Charlotte's death eliminated that continuity. How is it that we came to be aware of her art and this remarkable production that she managed in the few short years of her life?
Thank you with all of our hearts to her doctor in the little town of Villefranche-sur-Mer, where she was living. When she finished Live for Theater, she wrapped everything up in packages and took the packages to the doctor's home. And that's where the title of the book comes from. She is thought to have said to her doctor, "Keep this safe, it's my whole life." And the packages, thankfully, were marked property of Audley Moore, the heiress that she had stayed with. So after the war, the doctor and his family survived. He returned the packages to Audley. And ultimately, Charlotte's father and stepmother survived, went to France, hoping to find signs of her. And they were given these paintings, which they took back to Amsterdam because they refused to ever go back to Germany. They took them back to Amsterdam and put them in a closet for 10 years. They had no idea what to do with them. But we have them. And we have a few other, I mentioned the Yad Vashem paintings. There are a few other examples of Charlotte's art that have survived in various ways. And there is always the hope that in somebody's attic or basement or somewhere, there may be more out there. It's possible.
Remarkable. There's something about the horrific size, scope, and scale of the Holocaust and that whole period that obscures legions of significant figures about whom far too little is known. Over the years, I've come to feel like our souls, our minds only have room for a certain number of these extraordinary figures. So we know Anne Frank, and we know Elie Wiesel, and we know Simon Wiesenthal, and we know Hannah Senesh, and we know Raoul Wallenberg. But for every one of them, there are 1,000 stories of heroes or unique figures that we don't know unless an author or artist or journalist goes to the effort to make sure that we know these stories. And the additions that you've made to the historiography do precisely that. as we come to the tail end, and I know there are a few announcements coming at the end of our program, I wanted to just ask each of you to talk a little bit about, to those who haven't yet read your book, what is it that you'd like them to know about your book as we come to the end of this conversation? The teaser that will help encourage them further, if we've not done enough already, to saying, I've got to get to Barnes & Noble or Amazon or my local bookstore distributor as quickly as I can, because this is something I don't want to miss. Susan, can I start with you?
Certainly, and it's not a long answer. I really hope that anyone who reads this book will fall in love with Charlotte's paintings and her ability to get through to create this art in the same way that I did.
Charlotte's is a remarkable story, a poignant and powerful, emotional story, and an inspiring story of creation in the midst of destruction. I recommend it wholeheartedly, and I know that you'll enjoy it as much or more than I did. Simon, what do you want the prospective readers of the Island of Extraordinary Captives to know?
Well, my hope is really that the book stands as a tribute to the experiences of the people who lived through this, and also demonstrates how hope and creativity can flourish in even the most trying of circumstances. And I would say as well, there's a sort of spy mystery at the heart of it too. So if you enjoy that side of things, there's some excitement there that involves spies and MI5 as well.
And somebody described this book to me as it reads like a novel, but it is a tale of espionage and intrigue and internment and politics and war. I can't recommend this book more highly. And again, for a well-read reader of that period, this opened a page to a slice of the story with which I had no prior knowledge or familiarity, and therefore it enriches the experience of the reader. I want to extend my deep gratitude to both of you, not just for being here today and being such wonderful partners in conversation, but for your contribution. Your books become part of the narrative and the story, a critical part of the narrative. And you've done a mitzvah, you've done a noble and just deed by adding them to the pantheon of items that are available to us who want to know more. I want to extend my thanks again to our friends at the Jewish Book Council, to our friends at the Wingate Prize, for being part of this Global Jewish Literary Alliance inaugural event. And I can't let the moment pass without saying a word about my friends at JW3. This is the Jewish Community Center of London, our cousin in the world of Jewish community centers across the world. They and you all do us very proud. And I think with that, I'm going to turn things back, Michaela, to you at JW3. Thank you all again.
Thank you so much to Daron, to Simon, and to Susan. That was such a riveting conversation, and it's just wonderful to expand the concept of what Jewish culture is and can be. Thank you to our audience for joining us from all over the world for this inaugural event of the Global Jewish Literary Alliance. That event, I mean, I think you'll share my joy. There were such sensitive, thoughtful questions from Daron, and it's been such a pleasure watching this encounter between two writers on either side of the Atlantic, and a real privilege to encounter Peter Fleischman and such close range, thanks to your impeccable articulation and research. So to buy the books under discussion today, you can click on the links on the page on our website. And in addition to bringing you events like this, we invite you to explore and contribute to our Global Jewish Literary Alliance Resource Center, which will have an ever-evolving library of resources, competitions, event opportunities, and more in support of the creative and critical work of our Jewish literary community. And you'll find the link for that also on this page. And we're going to send you a message. We'll include those links. And we have recorded this event. So if you want to rewatch or you missed a part, you'll be able to access that. Thank you very much and goodbye.